Thank you.
Cybersecurity has become an issue for referendums like the 2016 presidential election in the United States. Since then, every country is trying to shield itself from hackers. We had an interview with John Banghart. He is a former director of cybersecurity at the U.S. National Security Council, and he talked about the challenges that Mexico faces towards our presidential elections on July 1st. Let's watch.
John, cybersecurity is a huge preoccupation, not only for the Mexican government, but especially for the electoral authorities. What advice do you have, since we're in the middle of this electoral process, and there's a lot of concern?
Yeah, so since we in the U.S. suffered our own issues back in 2016 related to election hacking, we've taken a lot of steps, and I think that those steps could apply well in Mexico also, which is understand what are the vulnerabilities in the voting systems. So the voting machines themselves, how are the votes being collected? Are those machines susceptible to being hacked? And if so, how do you protect them? That requires investment. It requires putting the right technology in place in order to make it very difficult for hackers to be successful. So you have to start by protecting those systems is really the first step.
Now, U.S. officials have recently commented that, at least in the U.S., the intelligence community has some concerns that the Russians would try to interfere in Mexico's electoral process. And other than that, we don't, there is no public information in terms of what the threat is and what we should be looking for. Do you have any sense what they could be talking about?
So it's difficult to answer for me specifically, only because it's less clear to me what some of the issues are in Mexico versus in the U.S. But what I can tell you is that if we were any example, it's not just about potentially disrupting elections. It's also about creating confusion, right? It's about creating distrust in the system itself. Does it have integrity? Is it actually working? Are people's votes being counted? I think it's possible that adversaries may want to create that sort of confusion. The reasons, I think, are more difficult to ascertain, but I do think that the threat is real.
Ultimately, it would seem that when you have these types of cyber threats, it's almost going to be impossible to vote over internet. I mean, that in many ways we're going to have to go back to and make sure that we maintain a system where literally you vote on paper, at least you have a paper trail.
So I'm an optimist. I actually think that we can continue to improve the technology where we will be able to vote over the internet. I think there are interesting technologies, blockchain technologies, new encryption technologies. I think it can be done. So until we get to that point, though, we have to take what we have and make it as safe and secure as possible. And part of what we're focused on in the U.S. is using the digital voting machines, but ensuring that there is a paper trail that can be audited. So if there's any question about whether a machine has been hacked or compromised, there's a paper trail we can go back to and ensure that everyone's vote gets counted fairly.
One last question, and I really appreciate you joining us. There's a problem, at least in trying to figure out who is ultimately responsible for cybersecurity in a country like Mexico. And it even becomes more complicated when you talk about cybersecurity and the electoral process. I mean, who do you call at 3 o'clock in the morning if you find out that the Russians are trying to hack, for example, one of the parties' websites or one of the parties' emails? I mean, there's just nobody to call.
So in the United States, the way that it works, if I think about campaigns, so the federal government doesn't have any real responsibility to protect the campaigns of candidates. So what ends up happening is that the campaigns themselves make investments. They hire experts. They hire companies to come and protect them. And certainly after 2016, we saw a tremendous increase in the amount of cybersecurity firms that were being hired by campaigns. So I think in part, every individual campaign has to take it upon themselves to protect themselves. When we have situations that do need to involve the government, it's typically law enforcement is where we go in the U.S. If you've been hacked or if you're worried about that, you start with law enforcement. Again, in Mexico, I'm not sure how it works, but certainly in the U.S., that's how we do it.
Thank you so much, John.
My pleasure. Thank you.